Pray with me, please. Nothing in my hand I bring, simply to thy cross I cling. Amen. The great British minister Dr. W.E. Sangster once told about a time that he was visiting the zoo. And as he was walking through the zoo, he came to this one cage where there was this magnificent eagle that was housed, a beautiful eagle, and he looked at these magnificent, powerful arms or wings on this eagle that were meant for soaring in the sky. And as he stood there looking at that magnificent bird, there was a person behind him who spoke out loud what he was thinking to himself. The fellow said, "Made for the skies and crammed in a cage." I want you to think about that phrase for a moment. Made for the skies, but crammed in a cage. Now there's a sermon in that. And I'm going to dig it out for you this morning. You see, that phrase brings a lot of images to mind, and one of them is the image of the Apostle Paul as he is writing this letter to the church at Rome. And as he is writing, he writes this beautiful verse. Don't let the world around you squeeze you into its own mold. That's the J.B. Phillips translation of that second verse in chapter 12. Don't let the world around you squeeze you into its own mold. Isn't that just another way of saying that you were made for the skies? You were made to soar in this life. So don't let yourself get crammed into a cage. It brings also to mind Søren Kierkegaard's story. Søren Kierkegaard was a noted Danish theologian. And he wrote about this wild duck. This wild duck is flying south for the winter. And as he is flying south, he's surveying the land down below, where he's going. And he notices this big barnyard. And in this barnyard are a few domesticated animals. But they are feasting on all kinds of corn. The farmer who had that barnyard was providing corn for his animals to eat throughout the winter months. And this wild duck, he sees this plenty of corn, and so I'm going to go have some lunch. And he heads down to the barnyard, and there he begins to eat and eat. And so he decided to stay a little longer. He stayed till the next day, and he began to eat. Such a simple thing. I mean, you don't have to really forage or anything. You just eat. It's all there for you. And so he decides to stay on there. And he eats, and he eats, and he eats. And he becomes kind of tame and domesticated there in the barnyard, feeding on that corn. Well, spring comes, and he can look up and he can see the other wild ducks heading north, going back. And he thinks to himself, well, I'll join them. And he begins to flap his wings, but he can't get off the ground because he had become so tame and so domesticated and so used to this corn being provided for him that he got so fat that he couldn't get off the ground. And so here was this bird that was made to soar. But instead he was trapped now in a cage of his own making. Or I think of Harry Emerson Fosdick, who was the pastor of the Riverside Church in New York City. And he told the story about the vulture, this wild bird of prey. And this vulture on a very, very cold winter day is kind of circling over the Niagara River, just a little bit, away from Buffalo, New York. And he's circling around and he sees a carcass in the water. And this carcass is floating and it's heading, guess where it's heading? It's heading to the falls. But this vulture is greedy and he's hungry. So he says, I'll take a chance. And he swoops down and he lands on that carcass and he applies his claws deep into that carcass. And he begins to eat. Well, that carcass is getting closer and closer and closer to the falls, and this vulture has every intent of flying away before the carcass goes over. But when it got to that point, he discovered that it was so cold that his claws had frozen to the carcass. And he couldn't get loose. So over the falls he goes to his death. The vulture was made for the sky, but he was crammed into a cage of his own making, imprisoned and destroyed by the clutch of his claws. And like a vulture, my beloved, our hands freeze on whatever it is we decide to feed on. And though we are meant for the skies, that's how God made us, we were meant to soar in this life, we are crammed in a cage. If we are self-centered, we are crammed in the cage of selfishness. If we feed on self-pity, then we are crammed in the cage of negativism. If we are hooked on drugs and alcohol or tranquilizers, then we are crammed in the cage of escapism. If we always maintain the status quo, then we are crammed in the cage of the closed mind. If we are jealous and resentful, we are crammed in the cage of hate. If we constantly talk badly about other people or talk about other people, then we are crammed in the cage of gossip. If we are anxiety-ridden, we are crammed in the cage of fear. So if we are frozen in one of these debilitating attitudes, we are headed for the falls. We have lost our freedom. We are made to soar. We are made for something higher in life than these things that somehow grab hold of us and imprison us in life, these cages. Have you ever noticed that many people let one little thing eclipse their lives and enslave them? Something like prejudice, or envy, or bad temper, or a worried spirit, or nervous tension or hostility? What about you? Is there anything in your life right now that you can think of, that you can put your fingers on, that is imprisoning you, which has crammed you into a cage? You were made for the skies. You were made for greatness. You were made to soar. Jesus said, I have come that you might have life and have it abundantly. But then we allow ourselves to get caught up in these petty things. And then we get crammed into the cage of whatever that petty thing happens to be. It's something to think about. And with those thoughts and with Paul's backdrop, when he says to us, don't let the world squeeze you into its own mold, with that ringing in your ears, what I want to do this morning very briefly is to look at 3 devastating attitudes. At first glance, they don't seem like much of an issue or much of a problem, but you know, they can immobilize us. They can imprison us. And probably much more dramatically than we realize. All right, the first one is self-pity. Self-pity. Self-pity, ingratitude, complaining, grumbling, whining, whatever you want to call it, it can be a terrible cage to get caught in. The noted and respected poet and writer Maya Angelou writes about this. And she makes a great point. She was reminiscing about growing up in Stamps, Arkansas. In Stamps, Arkansas. How do you get a name like Stamps? Do they make stamps there? Stamps, Arkansas. That's where she grew up. And she learned some great and valuable lessons from her grandmother. Maya Angelou's grandmother was well educated in the school of hard knocks. And not only that, she was wise in the way of the world. And she had a special way of getting right to the heart of the matter. Maya Angelou's grandmother didn't abide whiners and complainers. And she didn't want Maya to become a whiner or a complainer. So she demonstrated this in a very dramatic way. Whenever someone would come into her shop that she knew was something of a complainer or whiner, she would kind of conspiratorially look over at Maya and kind of do this number. And she says, now pay attention, because this is what you don't want to be. And then as this individual got wound up complaining about everything in the world, and it went on, and one thing after another was wrong, and complaining. Maya's grandmother would, kind of stand there stoically, and she would respond, and then she'd look over at Maya and do this. You see how bad this sounds? You don't want to be like this. And then when the complainer would leave, Maya's grandmother would turn to Maya and give her the lesson. A lesson Maya said she heard over and over and over again. Maya, did you hear that? Did you hear that? Did you hear how awful that whining, complaining sounds? Did you see how pitiful that kind of attitude is? And then the grandmother would end it with this statement. There are people all over the world who went to sleep last night. Rich and poor and white and black, but they will never wake up again. Sister, those who expected to rise did not. And those dead folks would give anything for just 5 minutes of this weather they've been complaining about. Or 10 minutes of that plowing that the person was complaining about. So you watch yourself about that complaining, sister. What you're supposed to do when you don't like a thing is change it. And if you can't change it, then change the way you think about it. Don't complain. That's pretty good advice, right? I'm going to copy that off and send it to all of you. Maya Angelou's grandmother was right, and she was saying, hear this, she was saying exactly what Jesus said. Jesus said, don't feel sorry for yourself. Don't be so fretful. Don't be anxious. Don't be so ungrateful. Don't be so self-centered. Don't give in to whining and complaining and griping and grumbling. Don't give in to self-pity. Don't get crammed into that cage because it will imprison you. In his book, Keeping First Things First, John Giles put it like this. This is what he wrote. He said, look out for self-pity. It is one of the most overlooked, powerful, devastating, clever, insidious forms of evil. Because it is not recognized as evil. It gets past our guard, it distorts reality and provokes anger. Self-pity takes away, hear this, our sense of humor. How important that is. It shuts down communications and stifles our creative power. It makes us concentrate on ourselves. Miss the good that we could be doing for others and blocks out the voice of God. Letting all that happen to us is what makes self-pity so pitiful. That's number one. Self-pity. Don't get crammed into that cage. You are meant for something higher and finer in life. Then second is resentment. The prison of resentment. Some years ago in Australia, there was this fella who was, in the county jail. He was a prisoner in the county jail. And he thought that he'd come up with a sort of an ingenious way to escape from the jail. When this truck pulled up to the loading dock, somehow he was able to slip under that truck without being seen. And he grabbed hold of the undercarriage of that truck and he held on for dear life. As that truck, drove out the front gate and then headed down a highway. And it drove for about 20 minutes until it finally stopped again. And when it stopped, the prisoner from the county jail, who was underneath that truck holding on to the undercarriage, he dropped to the ground. And he rolled out from under it thinking, I'm free. Now's my chance. But what actually happened was when he rolled out, he discovered he was now inside the state prison, which was only 5 miles away from the county jail. He had just gone from one prison to another prison. And my beloved, that's exactly what resentment does to us. It incarcerates us everywhere that we go. It taints everything that we do, and it poisons every relationship. I had a church member once. You see, this is what happens when a pastor pastors a church for a long time. He gets a lot of stories about the people, and they get told to the next church. So watch out. I don't know where I'll be going after this. Peggy says I'm retiring. So, well, there was this fella who was in one of my churches. He was absolutely the most resentful human being that I had ever met. I mean, you hated to see him coming, because it was just going to be one litany after another of things that were wrong and the things that he was upset about and mad about. He was upset with the world. He was upset with our country. He was upset with the president. Didn't matter whether it was a Democrat or Republican. He was upset with it. He was mad at the Congress. He was mad at his neighbors. He was mad at his children. He was mad at the church. He got mad at me. I mean, he was just mad. He just went from mad to mad, kind of like that guy in the undercarriage of the truck who was trying to escape the county jail and ends up in the state prison. He just went from mad to mad to mad. And you know, he wasn't always like that. That's the crazy thing. He was really a nice guy. He was kind, and he was generous, and he was helpful to his kids, and he loved his work, and he was very good at his work. But then everything turned, and he became the most bitter, resentful human being on the face of the earth. What happened? Well, he was married to a very beautiful woman. Married to her for something like close to 40 years. And she was devoted to him. She loved him. Dearly, she loved him. And the only thing that she wanted was to go on a cruise. All she wanted was to go on a cruise. And she would make the arrangements, but then he would back out. Can't do it. And he'd do that 4 or 5 times. You know, I was too busy. I've got so much work. He was a very important person in his job. But the plans would get all made, and she'd be all excited about it. Then he'd cancel it. Disappointment. And then he made the promise to her. He said, look, when I retire, we're going to go on that cruise. We're going to do it. We're going to go on that cruise. Well, what he didn't foresee was that 2 days after his retirement dinner, she had a massive stroke and died. He never took her on that cruise. And he got so mad. He got so mad at God, so mad at the church, mad at life, but most of all, mad at himself. And that resentment continues to roil up inside of him. There's the prison of self-pity, the prison of resentment. But God never meant us to live like that. God meant us to soar. God meant us to fly high in life. I have come that you might have life and have it abundantly. But we're the ones that mess it up with these things that rob us of our wholeness in life and cage us up. And third and finally, there's the rush to success. You know, the rat race, the rush to success, to becoming number one, always trying to get ahead, whatever you want to call it. It can be a terrible cage for people to get locked in. Now, I know when I look out over this group that most of you are done with your work. You've made your money, made your retirement, and perhaps you didn't get caught up in that rat race. But you have kids, and maybe grandkids, who can get caught up in it. And it can tear them apart. It can tear their families apart if that's what they focus on in their life and in making a living. Let me tell you a story. There was a fella who, he was a young father, and he had a busy life, busy work. And one evening he came home from work, and it had been a hard day, a tough day for him, and he was worn out from it. The only thing that he wanted to do was to get home and sit in his favorite chair with his feet up and drink a beer. Only thing that he wanted to do. And when he comes home, he's worn out, tired of work. He sits down in his chair with the newspaper, with his beer. He forgot that he had an 8-year-old son who was pretty inquisitive. And this 8-year-old son comes running into the room. Dad, Dad, Dad. You know how that goes? Dad, Dad, Dad. So glad you're home, Dad. Dad, can I ask you a question? How much money do you make an hour? And the father was kind of taken back by that question. Oh, and he said, Billy, I don't know. How would I know that? I don't know what that is, how much that is. And he said, I can't be bothered with this 20 questions thing. So, and I'm really tired. All I want to do is rest. And so Billy, maybe it's $20 an hour, he told him. Maybe it's about $20 an hour. And then Billy apologized to his father for having disturbed his rest, and he goes back to his room. Then a little while later, little Billy comes running out again. Dad, 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 can you loan me $7.55? And the father looked at him. Now he's really getting a little irritated. And he says, Billy, it's late. What are you going to do with $7.55 if I give it to you now? You can't spend it. What do you need that money for? And he said, why don't you go on off to bed? And so little Billy heads up to his room. But after a while, the conscience got to the dad, and he thinks maybe he's been a little bit rough on Billy, so he goes to Billy's room. And he said, Billy, I'm sorry. I'm sorry I was so short with you. I know I shouldn't have been that way. But I've decided to give you the $7.55. And he hands the $7.55 to Billy. And Billy's excited. I mean, he's just beside himself with excitement. Now I've got enough, Dad. Now I've got enough. And he reaches under his pillow and he pulls out a box, and he has some dollar bills in there, and he has some change in there. And he said, I've got enough now, Dad. And the father looked at him and he said, Billy, what is this all about? Why did you need that $7.55? He said, because now I have enough, Dad, to buy 1 hour of your time. You see, my beloved, the prison of self-pity, the prison of resentment, the prison to get ahead, to make it in life. These are things that imprison us. God didn't create us for this. This is not why God created us. And God is the only one who can set us free from it. Maybe some of you saw the movie with Denzel Washington called Hurricane Carter. It was a movie about Hurricane Carter, who was a boxer who spent a number of years in prison for a crime that he didn't commit. And here he is. Hurricane Carter speaks through some bars on this window. And he's talking to this young man who came to see him. This young man believes that Hurricane Carter is innocent. And so Hurricane Carter, trying to encourage this young man, said this: "Hate put me in prison, but love is going to bust me out." I don't know what imprisons you right now. You know, maybe it's guilt or fear or pride or anger. Maybe it's what we talked about, self-pity and resentment and the rush to get ahead. I don't know what imprisons me or imprisons you, but I do know this: God's love in Jesus Christ can bust us out. Amen.